Okay, welcome to ETP310 Inclusive Education. I'm going to talk you through the slideshow this week. Typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an online classroom, and for those of you who can join me for the online classroom, that's great, and for those of you who can't, you can just go ahead and watch it later. So this is an Inclusive Education prac unit, and my expectation is that you will be going on practicum sometime this semester. I know some of you have some questions about practicum, and possibly I think what I might do is just open a discussion board space for those questions about prac. So I'm just going to go quickly over the learning outcomes for the unit. What you're going to learn here is how to articulate current issues related to inclusion as they apply at the federal, state and territory level. So what are the kinds of laws and policies that support inclusion in the classroom? We're going to describe the diversity in today's classrooms and early childhood settings in terms of behaviours, values and norms, list the attributes of inclusive education programming in schools and early childhood education settings, and then plan an individualised education plan suitable for use in schools, early childhood settings and or early intervention programs. So we're going to be pretty focused, and hopefully you'll be putting some of this information to use in your pracs. So I just want you to spend a little bit of time and reflect. What do these learning outcomes mean? What are the kinds of things that you expect to learn about in this unit? Okay, how will that help you become a better teacher? Who are our students with special needs anyway? And think about, what is your experience with students with special needs? So really this unit is about inclusive education. We're thinking about this notion of inclusion and what it means to be included, which is why I asked on the discussion board for you to think about a time when you've been included or a time when you've been excluded, and what did that feel like? Feeling like you weren't able to participate. And sometimes this happens at very subtle levels, and sometimes it's not subtle at all, right? If we think about apartheid South Africa, there were signs up everywhere, whites only. The United States, southern United States. I'll have to find some images for the kinds of things that we have seen historically. So inclusion in its most general sense refers to the right to access and active participation and achieving equity through engagements in all aspects of daily life. What does equity mean? Can you define equity for me? I really like these questions that are in your textbook that just says, when we're thinking about equity, these are questions that might help us work out whether it's an equitable situation. Do all individuals or groups have the same chance of progressing to a particular level in the education system and beyond? Well, we know quite often that they don't. Depends on, certain groups don't do as well at school. Historically, we always blamed those people for not doing as well. But more recently, we argue, we're not meeting their needs. It's not because they're not able to. We are not designing systems appropriately for them. And I wrote down the myth of bootstraps, because there's an expression, I'm sure you've heard it, pull himself up by his bootstraps. And you might have one African American student that started in poverty and went to Harvard, and everyone uses that one individual as an example of how you can succeed if you just work harder. When in actual fact, for African Americans in the current contemporary American education system, much of the system works against them. There's disadvantage at every level. Their schools are more poorly funded. The schools have never been more segregated in history, really, and opportunities just are not equal. And arguably in Australian schools, Aboriginal children don't do as well as white children. Even white children who go to remote and rural schools still way outperform Aboriginal students. Why is that? Because often Aboriginal students are coming in as foreign language learners essentially, and are not given the supports that they might need to access the curriculum. So number 2, do all students enjoy equivalent learning conditions? This might be like, do you have a school that doesn't have running water? I went to schools in Chicago that they were fancier than a country club. Like the menus available for students at lunchtime, they could have anything they wanted. Their menus were as nice as the food court at a bank I once had a friend who worked at. I mean, just like great technology, beautiful school, manicured lawns, like just a beautiful place to be and learn. And even in my own schooling, we just had such good opportunities. Versus in the same city of Chicago, I'd go to a school where the food just looked disgusting. It came in like individually wrapped plastic packaging. It had been heated on bulk in the microwaves. The playgrounds were broken. There was broken glass on the playgrounds. It was dirty. The school was 150 years old. The heating system didn't work. In the summer there was no air conditioning. It was a pretty grim, or a school that have a police detector when you first walk in the school, and then lots of police personnel in the hallway. I mean, these are 2 very different kinds of schools and learning environments I'm describing to be happening in the same city. So why do one group of students get to enjoy the country club and the other get to go to something that's the equivalent of jail? Okay. Another question, do all students develop the skills and knowledge that are designated as the goals of the educational system? So if these are your goals, can students actually meet them based on what you're providing them with? And once they've left the education system, do individuals or groups have the same chances of using their acquired skills and knowledge to realise their potential in society? Okay, if we think about women, initially they wouldn't train women in most professions. And if you managed to get trained in a profession, it was very hard to get hired in the profession once you got out. So when we're thinking about equity and equality, they're not the same thing. Okay, people think the words sound the same, so they must be the same. They're not. Equality is when everyone gets the same, and equity is when people get what they need. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about the Matthew effect. That's a term coined by Stanovich in 1986. He's referencing the Bible, a story where the rich get rich and the poor get poorer, and it's often used in literacy research, where you might have poor readers in a class and good readers in a class, and you basically implement a reading program, and the good readers have the skills, the baseline skills already, that they just like take off. They become much better. The program really works for them. And then those children that weren't reading very well in the first place, basically the program helps them a little bit, or they didn't have the baseline skills to get the help they needed, and so you get a much bigger gap between the children. We see this all over the place in education, where we put strategies in place and they help some students and then they don't help other students. Okay, so when we're thinking about inclusion, I really like this diagram. There's lots of versions of it. Exclusion is when we exclude some people. They're not allowed to come to school because they've got disabilities. We segregate. Okay, this is our special schools where all kids with special needs go to this one school and it's not in the same place as our typically developing children. Or the integration is the model where we might have a special classroom inside a mainstream school, and then inclusion is where we mainstream kids throughout the day according to their educational needs and abilities. So inclusion in its most general sense refers to the rights to access and active participation in achieving equity through engagement in all aspects of daily life. It's founded in human rights principles, moral rights, legal rights, and human rights. And I want you to just have a bit of a think. Who do you think gets excluded in Australian classrooms and schools? So I want you to watch this video on human rights. The link is elsewhere in your module, and have a bit of a think. It's not a very long video. How does this relate to disability in education? What are the policies and documents that are in place to protect students with additional learning needs? And what's your role in advocating for human rights in the classroom? Do you think that teaching is political? Do you think that you as a teacher have a bigger responsibility promoting human rights, or maybe the same as everybody else? So in this unit, we're really focused on children with additional learning needs due to developmental delays and diagnoses, okay? I know in CDU you get a lot of other information. You have a unit on teaching students that are learning English as a second language. We're not talking about those students here. One of the primary differences is students that are learning English as a second language, they might have this, they usually have this typically developing brain. And one of the things brains are really good at is learning languages. And, learning language is pretty much the most remarkable thing we do in our lifetime. It's very fast. It's really amazing that children learn language from relatively little input, actually. So if a child is coming into the classroom and they already have a language that they're speaking at home and using to communicate with their family and friends and loved ones, they're probably going, with the right exposure, they'll pick up that second language quite quickly, which is different to some of our kids who have developmental needs that, maybe they get to school and they don't have any language yet, or they're using alternative augmentative communication, using something else. There's something different going on with their brain development. It's essential that you really can familiarise yourself with the Australian curriculum in all your units, and particularly the information under the Students with Disability tab. Okay, so your first assignment, these assignments have due dates, they're pass-fail assignments. You're going to write a paper around a barrier to inclusion that affects one or more students with identified learning needs or diagnosed disabilities in your education or childcare setting. So you're going to use national and international policy documents and other assigned course content to write a persuasive submission for change in your school. So this is not a straight up essay. This is persuasive. You might make it a letter. You might make it a letter to a politician. You might make it a letter to your principal. You want change. And you're going to make explicit the connections between the laws, policies and changes you're proposing. Okay, give you some examples I've heard of. Children with autism that are made to play in the hallway during the puzzles in the hallway during break time. They're not allowed out to the playground. Or a child who's in a wheelchair, and then the school does all their special occasions in a church hall that has a stage and the child can't access the stage. Another example is a parent told me that her children, she has twin boys, they have autism, the teacher had sent out notices about a school excursion and permission slips and hadn't sent the permission slips or the information to mum. And so mum only found out about the excursion when the night before the principal sent out a text message to everyone. And I hope you've got your permission slips in so you can all go to the zoo, let's say. And she was furious, right? You could write as if you're the parent of those children to find that you've been excluded from a learning opportunity because you hadn't been given the information, and she can only assume it's because her boys have autism and they'd be more work. As a school, you should not be having a field trip if everyone can't go. So if you pick something and you're like, well, we're not going to include these kids, that's not an appropriate outing. If you're not willing to take everybody in the class or in the year group, then you need to pick something else that you are willing to do the work involved, okay? This is inclusion. Your second essay is going to be more like a report, a more formal assignment. You're participating in an EAP meeting, an educational assessment plan meeting, or an individual education plan meeting for a student, and you're going to specify how you plan to support this child's learning needs through curricular adjustments and accommodations. So you'll describe the student's learning profile, their learning goals, the pedagogical supports you intend to put in place, considering what services or alternative educational pathways they need, and include the ways in which teacher might involve or collaborate with the parent or caregiver. And I just ask that you pick a different disability from one you addressed in assignment 1. So they're your assignments. Really the first assignment is designed to give you the broader context around policy and practice around special needs education in Australia. And then our second assignment is around planning for inclusion for a child. For next week, I want you to read chapter 1 or 2 of your text, introduce yourself on the discussion board. You're not going to work in a group. These, and then ignore the last point because that is not for you. Because you are going to do this work alone. Look, if you wanted to do the work in a group, if you wanted to do a group assignment, you could certainly email me and ask for that. And I would expect much better work. If there were 2 minds working on it, you would be graded differently than if you were going to work on it alone. But it's certainly an option. Some people like to work together, and it can be a good way to actually, look, we know individuals learning groups, and we also know that a lot of you guys online pretty much hate working in groups. So anyway, that's all I got for today. So next week, read chapter 1 and 2 of your text, introduce yourself on the discussion board, and next week we'll begin to talk about the policies that you'll be using in assignment 1.